Well, good evening. This is going to be our week 4 review. I posted our week 3 review yesterday, and I'm working through our week 4 review. So, again, a lot of great posts. Everybody has really done a good job with replying and making sure that you're providing feedback to your classmates. And that's really the key to these discussion type courses, is that everybody not only posts their points to a question, but that they reply back to their fellow classmates. So week 4 we covered, the first question was looking at various specialties that we deal with in our business and some of the risks that may be associated with them, and I asked which one do you think had the most challenging risks involved. So with that question, first one here was Andy. You kind of talked about high-angle rescue, and high-angle rescue certainly is something not everybody has to deal with. In some areas, they don't have ropes, they don't have carabiners, they don't have ascenders, they don't have the tools and the resources needed to do a high-angle rescue or the training to do that. Certainly when you have a patient that you have to bring down in a Stokes litter, Stokes basket, that requires a lot of training to safely strap them into that device and get them safely into whatever from whatever location they are down to the ground. So high-angle rescue certainly can pose a lot of risk to us as responders because of things like slip, trips, and falls again, twisting ankles, strains because we're pulling on ropes, and let alone working from heights. So certainly that is one, and again, if you're not experienced with that, it becomes even worse because you need to know how to tie the right knots and some of those kinds of things. So that's a good one that not everybody has a need to deal with. Kyle, a few of you also said hazmat. Hazmat has been my background for 26 years, I guess, 25 or 26 years, and that's how I got my start in the fire and emergency response business. I was doing hazmat response as a full-time hazmat response member and team leader for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. So, for me, because of all the training and having to deal with explosions and all sorts of that chemistry, and having an industrial hygiene background, so I had the chemistry background, that hasn't ever been as much of a risk for me, but for others it is, because it brings in unknowns. How are these chemicals reacting with each other? What kind of byproducts are being formed? And sometimes we may not know that when you combine one or two of the chemicals together, what is the outcome going to be? So certainly that is one that can pose risks that, if not handled properly, can make it more catastrophic. Garrett, you talked about behavioral normalization again, that standardization of deviance. Again, if we're complacent or we don't train on what we do in any of the aspects of what we do, that certainly can become a significant risk factor. Stuart, you talked about natural disasters. That certainly is that's a really important one, because natural disasters can change the playing field. It can certainly make it more difficult for us to respond. Maybe we can't get to dealing with the situation at hand because roads are blocked because of downed trees or power lines or flooding or whatever it might be. So definitely that is certainly a significant risk factor, is natural disasters. Like I said, down here in the Gulf Coast of Texas, I'm just learning, as I mentioned, I think in the week 3 video I just did here yesterday. I was at the National Hurricane Conference a week or so ago in New Orleans, and it is something that we don't see in Wisconsin, but it is a potential threat. What's nice with hurricanes is we typically have some warning, and we can adjust appropriately and prepare and evacuate and do all those things ahead of time. So, but once it happens, once that disaster happens, it does make it for an interesting and a riskier environment. You also said active threat of shooters. We're seeing that every day now. That risk is out there. I know here in Texas they're trying to pass a law that allows first responders to carry guns on them. I'm against that. I don't think that that's our job. I think it's the job of law enforcement. I think we put ourselves at greater risk if we're carrying a weapon. Not that it can't provide a useful tool if we got in a bad situation, but and like I said, I think we put ourselves at a greater risk of it being taken from us, from somebody that's maybe combative, things like that. So, but that's happening. We're seeing some departments getting bulletproof vests and riot gear and some of those kinds of things. So those are all things that we need to watch out for, and certainly the active shooter threat is an important one that we pay attention to, and again we work with law enforcement for that. Jacob, you said certainly things that are specific to our communities, and that's really what it comes down to, is that we know what risks are in our communities and that we handle those, or we train on them and we study them and we understand what we've got to do to deal with them. You also said civil disturbances, and we haven't seen much of that, although I think we're going to start seeing more of that with the way our world is going right now, and the economy and politics, and those against President Trump and those for President Trump, and all those things that we're seeing, civil disturbances. I think we're going to see more of that happening. But you can go back to the Rodney King riots down in Los Angeles, and the fire service certainly did get in the middle of some of that, and they were right in the middle of the war zone, if you will, and there is risks certainly with that. Jeremy, you talked about fitness, and we have kind of hit on that already in a few of the other questions. Physical fitness is certainly a key thing in order to keep us being able to do our job safely, and that certainly is a risk factor that we have to keep an eye on. Brandon Stryker, you talked about terrorism. Again, we're seeing terrorism throughout our world day in and day out, and one of these days it's going to happen here in the U.S. again. We do see domestic terrorism happening all the time, probably more so. It's probably happening more often than people realize, but it is happening. So that definitely poses a huge number of types of risks that we may have to encounter with that, and from explosives to shooters to chemicals to radiological, all those CBRNE, chemical, biological, radiological, explosive, those types of threats that we might deal with. Matthew, you talked about active shooter, and again, we're seeing that very common happening. I think it was just in Delaware that one of the police officers was killed here just a couple of days ago. So we just have to have good situational awareness and keep our eyes out on what's going on up there. Brendan, you said civil unrest, and again, we just kind of talked about that under what Jacob had to say, but civil unrest, Ferguson, for example, in Ferguson, Missouri, probably one of the more recent ones. Things like that. We just, again, try to do our best to maintain what we've got to do and have a good situational awareness of what's going on. Eric, you said the same thing with civil unrest, so same kinds of comments there. Drew, you said technical rescue, that kind of, the high angle rescue that Andy talked about, same concept. Technical rescue poses a lot of different risks, and it depends on what we're doing. I was a certified ice rescue person, just like most of you guys up in Wisconsin are. That I don't have to deal with here, but I do have more waterborne type issues down here. Like I said, the specialty that now I'm certified here is a marine firefighter. I just actually finished a class with that in February and got certified here in Texas for land-based marine firefighting. So technical rescue, depending on what it is, it may be toxic environments with a confined space. It might be movable equipment in a confined space. Maybe there's a conveyor system, or maybe there's some type of mechanical system that we've got to watch out for, electrical systems. So all those kinds of things under technical rescue. Shoring of trenches, again, a lot of different things we got to work on. Brandon, you talked about natural disasters, Brandon Acker, and that, yes, is definitely, again, we kind of talked about natural disasters again. Keegan, you said hazmat. Again, we kind of talked about it just because there is a lot of uncertainty. And the thing about hazmat, safe, slow, and methodical. That's what gets us out of trouble with a hazmat event. And sometimes people don't know why we're not going faster. But with hazmat events, safe, slow, and methodical, that's the best way to go. And then Darren, you mentioned terrorism. Again, we've kind of talked about that. Brandon talked about terrorism, and that is one of our threats, and will always continue to be one of our threats that we just have to be vigilant with and not become complacent. It's been going on 16 years since 9/11. 1995, we saw the sarin attacks in Tokyo. Some of those big situations that occurred have been some period of time since, and people forget what went on or what happened, and how do we prepare or be ready for that. So certainly terrorism is one we got to talk about and just be ready for again, and try not to be complacent. So that was question one, and again, all good positive discussion. Computer timed out here, so let me put it back up. Question two had to do with Life Safety Initiative 13 and mental health issues, and again, several good discussions here from all of you. Andy, you talked about firefighter suicide, and it definitely is becoming a serious problem. And it's not just firefighters. We're seeing it in law enforcement. We're seeing it, certainly military has experienced it, but we're seeing it in a lot of professional organizations that have to deal with stressful and traumatic situations. And certainly suicide is a problem. When I was in DeForest, I went through that. We did have one firefighter commit suicide. So I know what it does to a department. I know what kind of effect it can have on a department. So we just have to watch out for each other and make sure that we take care of each other. And I think somebody else here mentioned some of the resources, so I'll hit on those when I get to them. But there are a lot of resources out there that we just need to be sure that we make available to our members and provide our help and support to them. Garrett, you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, and certainly the military is seen how to deal with that, and or at least has looked at ways to try to manage it. We see a lot of situations that aren't any different than what the battlefield might be. So certainly, again, things that we got to pay attention to, and again, reach out for the resources. Kyle, you talked about, again, critical incident stress debriefing and seeing bad situations, and we do. That's our job. We see the people in their worst day of their life, and sometimes it's not a very nice scene, or it's not a very nice situation that we come across. We see things that nobody should see, and unfortunately, for some, it is something that they can't deal with, and others they figure out ways to deal with it. And certainly, critical incident stress debriefings are a way to cope with that. There's research showing that may not always be the best method, but it is a resource, and we should certainly use that resource to help the situation for our members. Jacqueline, you talked about line of duty death. In particular, you talked about how line of duty deaths, whether it's fire or law enforcement, and I think you had a neighboring or maybe in your community a police officer was killed in the line of duty here not too long ago. That's, we all come together. We all come together, whether it's law enforcement, fire. We all come together as a family, trying to support each other and support the families. And like I said, line of duty deaths don't go away. The effects of them continue to harm or hurt or just cause overall pain after that person's gone. Unfortunately, that person doesn't know it. They're gone. but everybody else has to live on and try to work through it, and that certainly can cause significant mental health issues, both within our fire departments or law enforcement agencies, and certainly with the families. Matthew, you talked about suicide. In particular, you kind of pointed out 25 attempts for every successful suicide. The individual that committed suicide on my department had threatened and attempted multiple times. His brother actually told me, he said, he said, if it hadn't been for the fire department, he would have probably done it a lot sooner. And he said you guys had kept him alive a lot longer. So he had struggled with this for years, and he obviously finally came up with a way to do it. And unfortunately, that, like I said, it hits your department pretty hard. There's resources, your employee assistance programs. If you could recognize some of the issues, and we can certainly lead people to going to the EAP, those are the things that as fellow teammates we should be trying to do. Eric, you talked about something that's kind of interesting. You said helping with anonymity, and trying to just encourage people to come forward and not, they don't have to have their names out there or whatever. Sometimes we have this macho attitude, I think, as you mentioned, that we can take care of and do everything, and that's not always the case. And in fact, we're probably more vulnerable than people realize emotionally. So, and mentally, and so that macho attitude is certainly not something that we need to just be putting out there. If we've got some concerns or issues, I've got one of my members right now. He's been dealing with an issues since an incident like 2.5 years ago, well before I got here, and we've gotten him into EAP, and I think things are doing a lot better with him. But again, if they don't want anything known, we just show them where the resources are and let them make the phone calls. So, Jeremy, you kind of just said, things with CISD and going from that to employee assistance programs and dealing with post-traumatic stress disorders, and certainly military. Military's got a lot of experience in how to deal with that, and we've kind of talked about that already. Brandon Acker, you brought out a really, really great point, and you talk about the use of a chaplain. They don't have to be an ordained minister, pastor, priest. They can just be somebody that is serving in that role as chaplain of your department. Usually we see they have some formal spiritual training or theological training, but they don't always have to be. But that chaplain is a critical resource. And if you don't have one with your department, you need to be reaching out and trying to find somebody that would be willing to step in and be the chaplain for the department. They are somebody that can listen and not certainly pass judgment or anything else, but somebody that you can reach out to and provide your concerns to or your issues with, and they're there to listen and help. So I thought that was a great comment about having your chaplain involved. Keegan, you talk about being able to keep an eye on people because issues that are going on tend to escalate. Sometimes we see people acting out and not taking care of themselves or becoming not who they were, and those kinds of issues start to escalate and become more of a problem. And if we don't recognize some of those things happening and what might have been the cause of that, hey, they went on this bad car accident with a infant or a young child, and now all of a sudden they're acting out. Those are the things that we got to watch out for and keep an eye out for. So that certainly is important issues there to keep track of. Jacob, as you said, encouraging each and every one of our members, each another, to seek help when we may have some problems, or again, understanding what they may have just gone through, what kind of call did they just come back from, and use all the different programs that are out there, whether it's employee assistance programs through your department, through your employer. The National Fallen Firefighters Foundation has a lot of resources. The there's ways to get help through those kinds of programs, and don't be afraid if you've got some concerns or issues that you reach out and get those. Brendan, as you had said too, carrying calls within us. I tell this to all my young firefighters. I had one that had a fairly traumatic call here a few weeks ago, and it bothered him, and I said, that first major trauma that somebody didn't make it, for most of us, that sticks with you. I can tell you my very first traumatic one. I can tell you the sights and sounds and smells and just every aspect of that call. I've worked through it. I've dealt with many since, but that first one a lot of times sticks with you. And I said it's not a bad thing. You just need to know what to do with it, or how to use that experience, and how to live through that. So we tend to carry calls with us, and there's nothing wrong with talking about it, and getting that off our chest. So that's a good thing. Darren, you kind of talked about the risky behavior and looking at signs when somebody is acting up and maybe not acting themselves, and then kind of again go back to what may have they gone through here in the most recent time frame, and take care of each other, look out for each other. That's the bottom line. Drew, kind of the same lines, and you talked about we need to know how to approach other members. Hey, we've been seeing you not act right, and just making sure to know the resources so that we can reach out to somebody and get those resources in their hands. That's really the bottom line there, and you certainly had the right comments with that. Stuart, you talk again about what resources are out there. In particular, you talked about PFFW and the employee assistance programs through them, and how you've had some folks that in your department have been referred to that, and it's helped them out a lot. So again, knowing your resources, and where you can get them, and certainly have those available. Those are key things. Those are key things to help each other out. And then lastly, Brandon Stryker, you talked again about IAFF, and again the resources that they have put together. You had mentioned the Center of Excellence for Behavioral Health Treatment and Recovery. I hadn't heard about that, so I thank you for putting that out there. That's a great resource. I've taken a look at it a little bit. If we know what resources are there and we can guide somebody to those resources, we take a better chance of them recovering from whatever mental or behavioral health issues they may have from a certain call or multiple calls, or whatever the outcome or whatever the reasons might be. So certainly very, very positive comment there, and a great resource. The last question had to do with technology and the improvements of technology, and which one of those do we think may have or may be one of the greatest technologies in your opinion. So again, a lot of great comments, a lot of very similar comments. Brandon Acker, you talked about SCBAs and TICs and radios. So the three things that are probably the most frequently updated and changed tools for us, certainly that's what they are. SCBAs, they are changing constantly and improving, and what have they done over the years? Well, they've become lighter and able to provide longer periods of time that we might use them. And certainly our thermal imaging cameras, I think those are a huge improvement in that what they used to be, and they used to be very large and were pretty darn expensive, and now you can get a pretty decent one for a reasonable amount of money. Not that it's not still several $1,000s. We just got two new ones, and they were about, I think, $5,800 a piece, but they are really good quality, good pictures. The screen and so forth, it's really second to none. And what are we seeing? As Scott, for example, has got ticks now in the masks of our SCBAs. I'm reluctant to probably buy those just yet. I think I want to have those go a couple of rounds before I look into them. But that's a resource that are out there, and certainly the radios have come a long way, and help us with communications. And obviously, as several of you said, NIOSH reports and so forth talk about communications as being one of the biggest contributing factors to line of duty deaths. So, yep, those are all great technologies that have helped us in what we do. Andy, you brought out one of my favorites, one of the best ones that a lot of people don't think about, but the carbon monoxide detectors. Certainly in Wisconsin, anyway. How many times do you go on a call, on an EMS call, and somebody's not feeling well? How often do you think about, especially like I said, in the wintertime, is it have anything to do with their heating system? We've all been there. We've all been on calls where when you put the carbon monoxide detector on, you realize that CO levels are too high and people are feeling sick, and they didn't know. It's the silent killer. And that is a great comment, and I was glad to see that, because that is something that we respond to day in and day out, especially, like I said, in the upper Midwest. And here I'm finding down here in Texas, they're not even required CO detectors in your home. But again, the heaters in most homes are, a lot of them are electric. My house, I don't have any gas in my house, so my water heater and everything else is all electric. So, but we do have houses with gas too. But anyway, that's a great comment there. Jeremy, you talked about the same things about our gear, radios, etc. Turnout gear you mentioned, and again, there are significant advances in turnout gear, and I think we talked about that in one of our previous discussion questions. And you also talked about training, and there has been some great advances in training and technology, and through NFPA 1403 and some of the other guidelines we follow, certainly does make our training better and safer, and prepares us better. Matthew, you talked about SCBAs, in particular the integrated pass devices, and the ticks and the heads-up displays now. Again, with the way they're developing these masks, these heads-up displays are becoming very common. I've got a little drawing, and it's at my office. And when I do the week 5 questions or comments discussion, I'll have that picture and I'll show it to you. But it talks about the firefighter 2025, and if you look at all the items that are on that individual, we're already getting there. And like I said, I'll bring it and show it when I do week 5 and kind of outline some of that. But Matthew, you talked about tank design, and certainly the fiber carbon wrapped tanks. It's certainly a whole lot more lightweight and makes it a little bit easier for us, to have that whole apparatus on our back. So great comments there. Garrett, you talked about lots of technology and things like fire retardant materials that can help reduce our risk, and and we're finding more and more fire retardant materials being used out there. That certainly is very true. Eric, you talked about using some of this great technology, but don't forget the old school way of doing things. And I thought that was a great comment, because that's the truth. I mean, we've got a lot of research, a lot of things are showing us how we can do things better and safer, but there's also some old school ways of doing things that is still the right way, and let's not forget some of that. And if you've got some old timers that are still in your departments, listen to them and listen to some of their comments and how things may have been done in the past, and then consider those, because sometimes that old school way may still be the best, or will still work for what we need to do. And again, each situation is different. Stuart, you talked about fire prevention and PPE, and just trying to reduce risk by a good fire prevention program, and that's a key aspect there. And certainly the technology that we can use, and collecting of data. You mentioned the collecting of data to help us in our fight for making sure our communities are safe, and really it is through data collection that we can show where our problems might be and how do we better address them. Brandon Stryker, you talked about communications and 911, Certainly was a helpful tool, but we also know what did 911 do for us. It increased our call volume. So it's a great tool for people to be able to just call and say, hey, I need help. And you also mentioned radios and the improvements with radio systems. Darren, you talk about sprinkler systems and use of sprinkler systems certainly in industry and in businesses, but hopefully someday down the line we'll see them being more prevalent in homes. And the technology of how sprinklers are designed and built and so forth, we're going to see, I would hope in time, that I don't feel it's very a significant cost for a residential sprinkler system, but that seems to be one of the sticking points, is that some think it is still fairly expensive, and maybe someday we'll see those costs get lower and become a viable tool and resource to put in our homes. Again, Kyle, you talked about SCBAs and ticks, and obviously it's the same kinds of things. They're just some great technologies, and they continue to get better every day. And where do those technologies come from? Most of the technology comes from the military. It was used overseas, it was used in a war situation or whatever it might be, and we over time then get advantage to that, and we can use those things in order to better our response. And you look at thermal imaging cameras, and you look at the night vision goggles for pilots, and any number of things. And where did that all come from? It came from the military, and now it's become available to us. So great technologies, and it's good that the government lets that stuff become public use at some point. Keegan, you just talked about a similar thing, fire protection systems and sprinklers and alarms. Certainly that fire prevention, if we can be proactive and stop issues on the front end, it's certainly going to make our lives safer. And Stuart, you actually put in your response there a really great chart. I hadn't, again, I learned stuff from our classes here too. I hadn't seen that chart before, so I thought that was a great chart of how costs with a fire protection system in versus not, the significant differences. And so that was a great chart. So thanks for adding that to the class, and not something we always see or think about. So again, great comments and great follow-up comments on that. Brendan, you talked about ticks again and bunker gear. You just kind of said all aspects of what we do, our SCBAs, our communication. We've seen such great leaps and bounds in technology, and it's not bound to stop. So we just have to take them and look at how can we best apply them to our situations. Jacqueline, you mentioned SCBAs as well, and all for the same reasons. Drew, you said research as a technology that is making our life better, and it is. The National Science National Institute of Science and Technology and Underwriters Laboratories are doing some phenomenal work. Dan Mandrikowski with NIST and Steve Kerber with UL. They're doing great work, and they do a lot of collaborative work together. And so when a report comes out from one of those, it's important that you read it and understand it and try to take it back and implement it. And then Jacob, you brought one other item that I don't think people tend to really think about again, and that is the powerlifting cots. In the EMS world, where are the injuries happening? And it's the lifting and the back strains. And that is such a great advancement and technology that we'd be lost without it. The injury rates continue to get better, get higher, and that was a great comment. So great comment on that. And you also talked about PPE and certainly where the increasing of temperatures, the gear is protecting us, and that has its pitfalls though, because we also we can get ourselves in bad situations if we're not careful and we're not paying attention. So as with all technology, it has its advantages, and sometimes the advantages are greater than the disadvantages, but we need to understand the disadvantages too, so that those disadvantages don't get us caught or get us into trouble. So again, great comments, great a discussion again under week 4, And like I said, I'm going through the week 5 stuff right now, so I will be getting that out to you, making an overview of that in the next day or so. And like I said, I think I'm finally getting caught back up. As I said yesterday, I apologize for being a little behind as I had some stuff going on here at work and was out of town so for a few days. So anyway, again, hopefully these little reviews that I'm going through have been helpful, and certainly would appreciate your feedback. I've had feedback from a couple of you that really enjoy me kind of going through that, and so if you've got a few minutes, and shoot me an email or something, just say what your thoughts are on me kind of reviewing everybody's comments and discussions. That would be appreciated for me, because it's kind of helping me revise, update, whatever, however I'm handling these courses. So with that, as you see, it's getting dark down here in Texas, and sitting out here again on my porch with dealing with a few mosquitoes. So I will talk to you all soon, and again, keep up the good work, and hope everybody's having a safe weekend, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks.